Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For the free wire tutorial today here on YouTube, we're going to be working on my beaded bicycle chain. Now this is a completely unisex design and I've created one with 6mm beads. I'm going to demonstrate on the board with 8mm beads and I'll give you measurements for both of those sizes as we move through the project. Let's head down to the board and take a closer look. So here we have the Unisex beaded bicycle chain, and as I give that a bit of a wiggle, you'll see why I've called it bicycle chain. It's got a lovely manoeuvrability to it, but it is quite a strong link. So this one has been created for my wrist, which is a 6.5 inch wrist. I've used 21 of those 6mm round beads. However, I'm going to demonstrate with some larger 8mm beads to see what size that makes up to instead. I will give you both dimensions as we move through, so you've got a couple of examples to work with. So in terms of wire, I'm going to be creating entirely in 1mm or 18 gauge wire, and I've pre-cut some wire already to use. Let me just pop this on the little bust so you can see that up in the top corner. So I have one piece of wire which is slightly longer, and then I have got, for the 8mm beads, I will be using some 3 1/4 inch lengths. For the 6mm beads, I used exactly 3 inch lengths of wire. So I've pre-cut 21 of these already, and they have been flush cut on both ends, and they're all ready to work with. So this design is based on my large hole horseshoe chain, which I made couple of years ago now, utilising some metallic beads with very large centres, so the sort that you might buy for charm bracelets for instance. But I've created this design today, which is the Unisex beaded bicycle chain. I just wanted to show you what each link kind of looks like, and that will be what our very first link looks like anyway, so it's just for reference really. We're going to ignore that longer piece of wire until the very end, so that one is 4 inches in length. For the 8mm beads, I'm working with 3 1/4 inch lengths of 1mm or 18 gauge wire. Now the first piece that I'm going to make doesn't have a bead at all because it forms one end of the chain, into which we'll add a hook clasp later. So all we're going to do here is find the centre. I'm using a rod which is 9.5mm, 0.37 of an inch, but you could use a straw or a pencil or something similar. It does need to be just a little bit larger than the chosen bead you're working with. So I'm going to wrap the wire around. Now you may be able to tell that one side is slightly longer than the other, so all I'm going to do is push the longer side over until they look equal. Once they look equal, you can kind of open them out slightly and just keep that nice and even. Now the tool that I'm going to be working with today are my memory wire finishing pliers, and I use these a lot in place of round nose pliers. I would suggest that you either grab something like this, find a very small pin on something, or use the smallest pin on your multi-step bail making pliers. So I'm going to apply that small pin. This is a 2mm pin that I'm working with, and I'm just going to roll up the end of this piece of wire. And again, for the 8mm beads, this is a 3.25, 3.25 inch length of wire, and I'm going to create a coil going towards the middle of that little U shape. I'm going to continue to bring this around until the cut end of wire sits over the top of that pin as I'm looking at it. So if I just remove that from the pliers, you can see the coil is going in that direction, so it's moving upwards and inwards, and the cut end is on that upward section. So from the opposite side, it looks beautifully neat and tidy. What we need to do then is to flip the design over to create the other side of this little horseshoe clasp. So my little limbic brain, my little animal brain says, I was just rotating towards me, therefore I must rotate towards me again. Well, if you do that, you'll have one pin going one way and one roll going the other way. So we actually want to just bring that down and away from us now. And remember to bring the cut end towards the middle of that U shape. If it's slightly lifted at all, whilst it's still on that pin, let's just pop that back on the pin, grab in your favourite fine tipped flat facing pliers. So I've got my bent chain nose pliers, and I'm just going to pinch that up and make sure that that pushes down, so that it sits flush on that little 2mm pin. Now that I've just probably tightened that up a little bit, it might be tricky to get off, but that is absolutely fine. So I'm going to continue to rotate that around, making sure that my spirals are neat and tidy and that the cut end is on the underside. So if I just pull that pin back out, flip it over, the cut end and the cut end match up, and both of those spirals are moving in the same direction. They're moving downwards. So that's really the first link in our chain. So I'm going to bring in my second ready cut piece, and again 1mm 18 gauge. For the 8mm beads I'm using 3.25 inch lengths. For those 6mm beads, for the slightly smaller version, I was using 3 inch lengths. So once I've got my second piece of wire ready to work, and I'm just going to smooth and warm that through a handful of times, I'm going to grab the first of my 8mm round beads. I'm going to pop the end of that wire through the first of those little rolled up loopy bits, add the bead into position, retract that pin all the way back through, and then make sure that the wire comes out the other side. The next thing that I'm going to do is ensure that that is as centralised visually as I can get it. Now you could grab a ruler, you could have a stunt piece of wire that measures exactly the same length so that you can get that centralised, but all I'm going to do here is just push up on both sides and check that those pins are close together in length. The next thing I'm going to do is just softly compress from either side. Now I would say do this by hand. You get a little bit of a dimple in your finger for a few minutes, but it's not the end of the world, because if you try to do that with a tool, you might just press that little bit too hard. The pressure you can achieve by hand is much safer for this design. So we're going to now bring in those memory wire finishing pliers again and repeat the exact same process. So because the underside of the coil is downwards towards the desk, I need to make that first bend downwards and away from me, ensuring that the cut tail moves towards the centre of that little U-shaped form. Get that little end bit and give it a tiny squish as you move through, and then we're going to continue rotating that around till we end up with that cut side being on the underneath again. So just make sure that's nice and neat and tidy. If you need to compress that spring, it's easier to do it whilst it's on the pin of your plier. Remove that pin out of the way. You might need to give it a wiggle, and then flip over and do the same thing again, remembering that you want to match those two little spirals or two little coils so that they sit in the same orientation. So this time the small pin goes on the top, and I'm going to start rotating that around. Again, the cut end needs to go towards the middle. So as I rotate that wire around and around, making sure that those are the same distance from the exit point on the preceding bead, making sure everything is sitting down nice and neatly, and you can just go over the top with your flat facing pliers if you need to. Give that a teeny tiny assist to sit super neatly. So let's retract those pliers out of the way, and you have guessed it, we're going to bring in another cut piece of wire. So this is a 3.25 or a 3¼ inch length of wire. Pop that wire through the first hole in your little wire form, pop it through the bead, retract that pin back and push that through to the middle. Now you might be able to see there's a little bit of a gap. Don't worry, because what's going to happen is I'm just going to pinch that up gently, equalise the two sides of my wire and bring that up and together to the centre. Now you do have a tiny bit of wiggle room, so if you really do misjudge it and one side is a little bit longer than the other, you can simply trim away a fraction of a millimetre to get those to match. All you will need to do is repeat that multiple times. So I'm going to use all the beads that I had on this little stretch bracelet that I cut, which I think was 21, but I'll check back in with you at the end of this video and give you the dimensions that were achieved and exactly how many beads I used. So I'll meet you back in a moment when I get to the other end of this chain. I've continued in exactly the same way, adding a bead with one of those lengths of wire, and I've so far got 21 beads in the chain. It turns out I had 22 on the elastic bracelet. So before you add the last one, we're going to cut a slightly longer length of wire and we're going to make a simplified hook clasp. Now there's a couple of ways that you can make this, but I'm going to show you a really easy way to finish the bracelet off. My last piece of wire is a 4-inch length of 1mm or 18 gauge. If you can get a slightly heavier piece of wire, for instance a 1.25 or 16 gauge through, then do feel free to use one of those, as it will help that clasp last a lovely long time. However, my beads are only going to be accepting a 1mm wire. So let's just pop that into position. And again, on your last link, you need a slightly longer piece of wire. So this one is a 4-inch length. Now I'm going to do a single hook clasp because I think it gives a cleaner finish. But once I have made this single hook clasp, I'll show you on the other demonstration piece how I've gone for a double hook clasp. And I will talk you through the process to create that one. So I'm going to slightly off center that piece of wire, so there's more over to one side. There's around about an inch and a smidge on the one side, and I'm just going to put the same bends in that we have been doing so far. I'm then going to get those to cross over centrally, like so. And once they've come to a little bit of a point in the middle, I'm going to turn the long wire away, so that it's as if it's a straight line running through all of those beads. And then the shorter wire, I'm going to turn sideways at a right angle to the straight one. Once you've got that in position and you're happy with it, I'm going to grip across both of those wires without squishing down where they cross over, and just wrap the shorter wire around the longer wire. Now, as I have done in the last couple of videos, I'm just using up some fairly unpleasant wire to get through it because I don't like wasting. So this is a little bit tense. If you're working with a beautiful raw copper or a good quality copper core wire, this will flow much more easily for you. So what we need to do is to retain this triangular shape whilst we're wrapping around that central core. So you could use nylon jaw pliers and a soft touch to make sure you don't mark that wire, but I'm just going to make sure that that tail comes all the way around, and in an ideal world that tail will finish underneath. So if it's a little bit longer, you can trim a little bit away. I'm just going to trim just a snippet away, just a tiny little millimetre, and then just get that to sit down flush on that central bar. So what we're looking to do is to create a nice neat wrap and to keep that centralised. Now what we need to do is assess that we have the bracelet in the correct orientation. So I want the curly bits to be underneath, and then the nice rounded bits to be on top. And what we're going to do is have a look at creating a nice, very simple hook. So we're going to just bend the bracelet round so we know which side is wrist side. I'm going to grip across that central wire and push it inwards towards the wrist. We're then going to use a nice rounded form to generate a little bit of a simple hook. I think I'll go for number 3 on my bail making pliers, and draw that back outwards. Bring the end down flush for a moment, so that that will sit inside and hook into the other section. And what we need to do is just trim a tiny bit away and then curl it over. So I'm going to trim that to about 1/4 of an inch past the angle change. Let's get that out the way. And then use very small round pliers where possible to generate a teeny tiny turn back on the end, just so that that stays nice and neat. So I'm just going to rotate those around and push them over. Now in an ideal world, what we will want to do is to just hammer that gently so that it remains strong, because I wasn't able to get a heavier wire through the bead. I've only been able to use that 1mm gauge, and I do want this to be nice and neat and tidy. But before I hammer it, I'm going to ensure that all parts are assembled as I want them to be. So I'm going to tighten up that coil, make sure it sits square at 90 degrees to the body of the bracelet, and making sure that it is sitting in the correct orientation. Let me just show you that there for a second. Once you've got that all set up, we're going to put the flat pieces of wire onto a block and just give that a quick hammer. Now I'm using a tiny hammer because I've got a little bit of limited space today, and I'm just going to close that up. It very frequently, when you're hammering an arc like this, it will just open out slightly, so feel free to put that back into position. Don't strike down where you've got wires crossing over, and I'm just going to give that one final push. So there is your Unisex beaded bicycle chain. That's got a single clasp on it. Now I've used 22 beads in the end, so let's just grab my ruler and we'll see what the finished wearable length is, so you can adjust accordingly. So it's about 8 3/4 inches, so I'm going to write that down, 8 3/4 inches. And you can adjust that with more beads or fewer beads should you need to. Just going to show you on the other bracelet that instead of making a wire wrapped single hook, I simply brought the two pieces together in a bit of a triangle form. So bent them towards the middle and then pushed them both away and created two little hooks. Then I opened those out, hammered them individually and pushed them back together. Now that functions really nicely as well. So you've got two options with how you can finish that off. You could, of course, add in a clasp of your choosing just by creating a very small wrapped loop at the end and starting with a small wrapped loop. But I like the idea of just using the same technique throughout to create those lovely unisex beaded bicycle chains. So let's just pop that one down as well, side by side. We've got 6mm howlite and 8mm howlite. I'll take a photograph of both of those and leave it on the outro screen for you. Because of the tension of the wire through the bead and how it curves when it's passed through the spirals you made on the preceding section, it has a tendency to curve round on itself anyway. It's absolutely delightful to wear on the wrist. And because of how the beads are located within that design, the wire doesn't even touch your skin. So you're feeling a lot of gemstones, but there's a really beautiful sort of industrial feel to that design. I'll leave photos of those for you in just a moment. If you're enjoying the videos, please do like, share, subscribe and hype, and let me know in the comments down below if there's anything you'd like me to create for you in a future video. Take care, have a brilliant day, bye for now.